Each and every day, enjoy the Simple Six menu at Subway, an entire made-for-you meal featuring one of 6 6-inch sandwiches like the Italian BMT or Black Forest ham, with any bag of chips and a 21-ounce drink, all for only $6. Subway. Eat fresh.
The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects. The BS Report. The BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report, taping this on a Thursday afternoon, West Coast time. Halloween, one of my favorite days of the year. Happy 56th birthday to Michael Myers. I'm sorry I screwed that up. I tweeted it was his 53rd birthday. Actually, his 56th birthday today. My favorite murderer ever, Michael Myers. And yesterday the Red Sox won the World Series. My son's birthday this week. This is just a great day. So let's cap it off with the 30 for 30 podcast. On Tuesday, we ran a podcast called This Is What They Want. A 30 for 30 called This Is What They Want about Jimmy Connors, 91, U.S. Open. I remember all of those matches. I was home in college watching them. Brian Koppelman, who was our guest today, one of the co-directors of that, and also somebody that you might not realize was in your life as much as he has been. What made you want to do that Connors doc?
Well, I grew up like 20 minutes from Flushing Meadows, along with my lifelong best friend and filmmaking partner, David Levine. And I grew up 20 minutes from there. I worked at the Open. When I was 16, I got a job there selling Alessi clothes. And I would be around the U.S. Open all the time. And I was a huge Mac fan. But, Connors, the pull that Jimmy Connors has is, kind of similar to Darth Vader's pull. And by 91, when he was this old man making the run, I loved that guy more than any other athlete in the world. But, I was always fascinated by the fact that he was basically like a pro wrestling heel who would get these giant pops from the crowd in professional tennis. He was like the only person really like that.
Yeah. And
so I was fascinated by it.
And he fed off it too. I was also a Johnny Mac guy. That was my dude. It's my favorite tennis player ever. I feel like you had to pick sides. You couldn't like McEnroe and Connors. You had to pick one. And they had some good battles. And actually, you had the clip in the film. What was it? 77 Wimbledon. Connors got mad at him.
Right away. Connors tried to really you just don't imagine today in tennis seeing two guys almost actually have a real fight on center court at Wimbledon.
It would have been, it probably would have led Sports Center, just to guess.
McEnroe told us that Jimmy just completely froze him, that it worked. That Jimmy had a strategy, which was this guy is, Jimmy said it too, he's a lefty, he's Irish, he wants what I have, and I'm not going to let him have it. And Jimmy's strategy was to freeze Mac out, get in his head. And I think he's the only guy ever, because Mac was so great at the mental warfare, I think Jimmy's the only guy ever who was able to gain an advantage over McEnroe mentally.
And what's interesting is Connors had his run. I'm going to say, what was the Rose Bowl Wimbledon, 74?
Yeah.
That's when it started. During that time, he dated Chris Evert, which was the most famous intersports relationship, I think, probably ever. I don't even know what the equivalent would be, like Tiger Woods dating Serena Williams?
Yeah, it was. They were the two, in a way, most famous American athletes at the time, or certainly two of the 10 most famous.
Yeah, no question. I mean, might even go 2 of the top 7. She was the most famous female athlete. So he has the run. Then McEnroe comes in, and all of a sudden it's McEnroe and Borg, and Connors gets kind of shuttled off to the side. And it looked like, he had a really awesome run. He was the most famous tennis player alive. He kind of dominated the mid-70s, and it looked like it was going to be, on the downside. And then all of a sudden, a big resurgence in 82. He won the U.S. Open and he won Wimbledon and had this whole second renaissance. Why did you think that happened?
Well, I think that question is part of what made us want to interview Jimmy and spend that much time with him, which was like, what makes a guy that much of a winner? Like, what kind of need did that guy have to reassert his dominance? I mean, Agassi kind of had a late run where he, won some majors late in his life. But the fire that burns in Jimmy, I mean, Bill, where do you think you can look in other sports for kind of like the equivalent of a guy who never, ever took his foot off the gas over the course of a 20-year career?
I think Agassi to me is different in this respect. I feel like he was just a head case.
Yes. Oh, totally.
And he never got his shit together until it was too late. Connors, so he won 3 of the 4 majors in 74, made the finals in 3 of them in 75, won U.S. Open in 76, 2 finals in 77, and then in 78, finals at Wimbledon, then he won the U.S. Open. That's a pretty nice run. Then he just got passed. Like Borg and McEnroe just went over him. And usually when that happens, especially in tennis, you see it happen in golf too, it's over.
Well, there were some technical. So Jimmy did do some technical things. He learned how to take Borg's topspin on the rise. He made his serve much better. He started volleying more. Like there were technical adjustments that he made, but I think it was more that he refused to let himself. He really willed himself to be the best in the world. He couldn't live with himself not dominating.
I have another theory.
Go ahead.
Probably not going to like this. When did he meet the Playmate of the Year?
in what year? 78, I think.
It said, according to Wikipedia, which is never wrong, as we know, since 79, he has been married to former Playboy model Patty McGuire, who no website will ever do this, but if you were going to do the greatest Playmates of the 70s and 80s, she would have been in the top 3. Just an iconic Playmate. And
no argument. I was on the golf course today. I had to leave my friend Jeff Tepper here to come do this happily. And Patty McGuire came up today, and the guy said one of the all-time greats.
All-timer.
Yep.
All-timer. Like the same way like we might talk about like Dr. J, Ken Stabler, some of the icons of the 70s. Like she's right there. And I don't know if it's a coincidence that Connors won nothing in 79, 80, and 81, and then rallied back in 82. And I think, even though he was winning, I still feel like I have no evidence of this because I was living in Boston at the time, but I still feel like America was kind of pro McEnroe in that whole thing. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah. I mean, when McEnroe would play Borg, America was pro McEnroe, but when Jimmy would play Ken Rosewall, everyone, even Americans, would root against Jimmy because Rosewall was the grand old man of the game and everything. But initially, got to remember the papers killed Mac. Kids like us liked Mac better because Mac was edgy and cool and had a big sense of humor. But middle America, by that point, had mostly started to root more for Jimmy. Yeah.
That makes sense. I always felt like McEnroe was like an artist. And that sounds weird to call a tennis player an artist, but if a tennis player is ever going to be an artist, it would have been him. Just everything he did and the precision. That's what I loved about him. I mean, he was so great at the net. It was incredible to watch him play doubles. He would get so upset. Like when Connors got mad at the umpires, it was always for show, and it was always as a mind play, and he was always messing with the other guy and trying to intimidate the umpires.
Yes.
McEnroe.
Yes.
Was genuinely upset. Just couldn't believe he lived in a world where some other idiot existed and was screwing up his match, and it really just drove him crazy. And that I felt like the difference.
Yeah, well, also Connors, you never saw Connors get mad at himself, whereas Johnny Mac was enraged at himself all the time.
Yep.
And he was living in a state of frustration at his own imperfection, and then at the insanity around him.
Yeah.
To him, the world was kind of like Terry Gilliam's Brazil or something. And he was the only one who could see the absurdity of it all. That's why we all loved McEnroe. Jimmy was just like, I'm moving forward and I'm going to use anything I can. If I can distract you with that, that's why I compare him. I think he's like a like he's like Ernie Ladd or something looking for the foreign object.
Right. Well, if we had an extra half hour with this film, and I wish we had, because I felt like there was a second sub-story here, which was the death of tennis in the mid-'80s.
Yes.
And, the Lendl era. And the era that we grew up with, we're roughly the same age, but the era that we grew up with of these passionate guys and these cool guys, and Borg was cool, and Gerolaitis was cool, and Roscoe Tanner had the hard serve, and McEnroe and Connors, and just went on down the line. And then by the mid-'80s, all of a sudden, it was like a Lendl, and it was Stefan Edberg, and just these people that you weren't going out of your way to see them play tennis. So out of nowhere, 91 happens, and Connors starts winning. And I was a senior in college when this happened. I'm pretty sure I was a senior, right? Was it 91?
91, yeah.
Now, another thing you couldn't cover in this doc because we didn't have the time, but the year before, I felt like McEnroe paved the way for this. Because Johnny Mac made, I think, the semis. I'm going to say, you remember that?
Yeah, I know he did. I don't know how deep a run he made, but yeah, he made a run. But Jimmy missed that tournament because he was injured.
Right. But when, I guess really the first one was Nicklaus in '86. If you're going to just switch sports, like the improbable guy who we thought was dead, kind of rallying back, and Nicklaus actually won the '86 Masters.
There was one story that you'll like about what happened to set up the 91 Open that we couldn't get anyone to tell us on camera, but Jimmy's son Brett told it to us off camera, and then Jimmy wouldn't quite confirm it. But there's a tiny tournament before the Open. There used to be called the Hamlet out on Long Island, like a half hour away from where the Open is played. And Jimmy got to the semis of that tournament against Stefan Edberg. And he's playing in this tournament, and he wins it. They split sets. It's a three-setter, and they split sets. And Brett tells the story. He's watching his dad play. And in the third set, it's clear that if Jimmy can just bear down, he can win the tournament. He can beat Edberg and then win in the finals. But it's a hard-fought match. Edberg gets up a break. Jimmy has the opportunity of best return in history to break him. And Brett said the only time in his life he ever saw his dad fold. His dad threw the set away and threw the tournament away. And they get in the car to head back to Manhattan where they were staying. And Brett looked at his dad and said, "What happened? I don't understand. You had it." And his dad said, "I'm ready. I know that I'm ready. I can stick in this tournament coming up. And if I did what I had to do to win that, I don't think I could win the Open. So I had to give it up." The only time he ever did it. But he knew.
Wow.
Yeah, he knew if I make a push here, I'm going to take too much out of myself, and it's going to hurt me in what matters. So while the rest of the world wrote him off, Jimmy had enough confidence that he could win the U.S. Open or go deep in it that he blew the opportunity to win another tournament against, one of the three best players in the world, Stefan Edberg.
Yeah, so in 1990, McEnroe made the semis and got crushed by Sampras, but paved the way. And I was a junior in college that year, and we were watching all those because they were the great thing about the U.S. Open, especially when you're younger, is how late the matches are going on.
Yeah.
Like they're going on past midnight. We're watching these going nuts. And then the next year, when Connors beats McEnroe, I think in round one, and then it wasn't until the iconic Krickstein match, which is pretty much the heart of your film.
Yeah, the fourth round.
As that comeback was happening, in my head, I was like, "Oh, this can happen. We just saw this with Mac. Like, this is in play." And it's funny that both things ended up the same way with, just some young gun just crushing them. Like McEnroe got destroyed by Sampras and Connors got destroyed by Courier. And in the moment, you kind of knew right away. In the first set, you knew it wasn't going to happen.
Well, yeah,
right?
Courier's also in his own way a fascinating guy. I mean, he, because Courier has the kind of grit that Connors had. I think Courier's a good guy, but he had the kind of grit because, he was written off by Balotelli. He had a huge chip on his shoulder because Balotelli chose Agassi over him, and everyone thought Agassi would win the first major, and then, of course, Courier did. And this is when Courier was really beginning to really say to everybody, like, look, I'm the guy. And
right.
He was not going to be defeated. He was churning too hard to let Jimmy get a mental edge on him. And it's funny, both Sampras and Courier became number one in the world.
Right.
So these guys, Mac and Connors lost to guys who really did usurp them, who really took what they thought was their rightful place.
That actually could be its own film, is that the class that came up to replace McEnroe and Connors. Sampras, Courier, Agassi.
Yeah.
Who else? There was one other one, right? Wasn't there?
Aaron didn't Aaron didn't end up getting all the way there, but he did get to the top 10, and he was at Balotelli with those guys.
Yeah, might have been one more too. That was like that first wave.
There were other Americans then, but those guys were the great Americans. Those three. Michael Chang. The fourth one was Michael Chang, Bill.
Right. You're right. Krickstein, who comes off as wildly sympathetic in this, and you just feel terrible for him because, as he said, it rains every year in the Open, and they play the Krickstein-Connors match, and now he's lost that match 75 times. Were you surprised? We had a screening for this that sadly I couldn't go to because I wasn't in town, but in New York, and Krickstein went. and was like very gracious and answered questions. Were you surprised he went?
Well, when Levine and I went down to Florida to interview Aaron, we were so touched by him and by his story. And, you've seen the film a number of times, but it was incredible fun watching Twitter because, at the last 3 minutes or 4 minutes of the movie, sort of the relationship of Jimmy and Aaron had takes a weird turn. And when you watched people, they empathized so strongly with Aaron that it's like en masse, they kind of turn and they're with Jimmy and they're supporting him, and then they can't understand, something that he did or didn't do to Aaron at the end of the film. And we found that out when we went down there. We just went down there thinking we're going to talk about the match, and then he revealed these details of his life and the relationship that he had with Connors. And he's a total gentleman, a totally sympathetic figure. And I think I don't know what you think about whether you have to be like Garnett or something to really be a champion, whether you have to have the ability to turn cold. But Aaron Krickstein does not have the ability to turn cold. I mean, he had the best forehand in tennis for like 3 years and never won a major because somehow to me, he just wasn't built with the stuff that lets you step on the other guy's throat.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think tennis and golf are the two sports where you kind of seem to have one or two personalities. Either you have to be that step on the throat guy, or you just kind of have to be a Vulcan.
Right.
And it seems like if you're in the middle, that's when you fall into trouble. And if you can feel the pressure, and if you can carry scars from the previous match that you blew and things like that, that's when you get into danger. Connors
who are some Vulcan examples?
I think Lendl was like that.
Right.
I think Martino was a step on your throat type player. I think Sampras was a total Vulcan. And I think Federer's a Vulcan. I don't think Federer goes out there wanting to destroy the other guy. I think he just has figured out
he wants to play pure and beautiful tennis, and it's all about in a way, he's a process guy.
Yeah, and Nadal, I feel like, is more of a step on your throat guy. He's looking for the edge.
And Joker definitely is.
Definitely. But I think if you're in the middle, that's trouble. Do you feel like
I don't want to get in the weeds of tennis, but Nadal is interesting because when you talk to guys about in the tennis world, because we were talking to all these different guys, they all say that Nadal is like the kindest person in the world. That weirdly, he is humble, sweet, and like isn't actually out there to kill you, but he's not a Vulcan either. He's like a happy winner somehow.
He's so physically gifted. Maybe it's just easy for him. It's like he's like LeBron. So Connors, big picture. I think it's interesting. We're growing up. He's one of the biggest athletes in the world. Then he peaks again, goes away, comes back, has this one last run, goes away. And probably if you're under 35, I'm going to say, if you're under like 33, you don't care about him. You don't know anything about him. What was the feedback you got from people who missed the Connors run the first time and then watched his doc?
That's a great question. I imagine you got the same feedback I got, which was like, how come I didn't know about this guy? This is incredible. Twitter kind of lit up with people saying how much they loved him during it, or wow, this guy. People were really captivated. Like I wasn't sure whether people would come away loving him or hating him. I love him. I love Connors. I love the fact that he exists, that a guy who's that much of a Terminator exists. And I love the fact that he was so bracingly honest and knows exactly who he is. And I feel like that's what people come away with. They just think this guy's a badass, man. And he's like not even politically correct or not politically correct. He's like so far past all that. He just exists. He just like is pure winning, killing, terminating, and I don't care. And I don't think there are that many guys. Kobe is like that on some level, but I don't think there are that many guys on the landscape now who are that kind of like unapologetically overt about their need to destroy. And I think people got off on that, don't you? What kind of reaction did you see?
Yeah, Kobe's like that. Well, it's the same thing anytime we do one of these. And this is something we didn't realize until about 2 years into the process after we had run a bunch of them, is that the stories that we think people know, you forget, if there's some sort of age cutoff where they just don't know it. There was a 2-hour Fab Five film we did.
Right.
And you assume everyone knows the 5-5. Like, how can you forget the 5-5?
All of us remember exactly where we were when Weber called the timeout.
The whole thing. Like 40 million people watched that game. Probably the most famous college team that never won a title. And Jalen and Chris and Juwan all go in the NBA and have big careers. You just assume everyone knows the story. And then you run it and there's a cutoff. And anybody under 29 knows nothing about the story and is experiencing it for the first time. So that part's cool. And then I think the other thing we saw is people our age who watch these films with their kids.
Yes.
And then they're reliving whatever the moment is, whether it's Connors or Fab Five or whatever. They're reliving them through their kids' reactions to it, which is a whole other kind of experience. And, you have somebody who's 12 who doesn't know who the hell Jimmy Connors is. It's their introduction to him.
Well, that's something.
That's cool.
That's something that we love about the 30 for 30s, because Levine and I watched, all the ones we missed when we were going to go do this. And I knew nothing about the two Escobar story, for instance. And I loved, thinking I walk around like not quite as much as you because you are so steeped in it, but I walk around, we've had a lot of conversations. Like, I'm a pretty big sports fan. I know a lot about, but I had no knowledge of any of that. And so that's like a great thing that 30 for 30 does. There are the stories, like I knew Ricky Williams was a little bit odd, but I mean, watching that thing, I fell in love with Ricky Williams. He's like one of my favorite athletes who ever lived now. And that's part of why we wanted to do a 30 for 30 and why we wanted to get into the story of Jimmy. And Aaron was I'll say Aaron going in was a huge pull to us because we were 16 when he was 16, and we would go to the Open and watch him, and he seemed like a god to us, Bill. You're maybe, because you're 2 years or 3 years younger than I am, so I don't know if you really remember how kind of cool Aaron was when he was the first 16-year-old winning little tournaments professionally.
Yeah.
And so to see his kind of, the moment where it all crested for him and went away, that was like a huge pull also. And I think that's something that people, if they didn't know who Connors was, they had no idea who Krickstein was. And I think that he'll find, don't you think when Krickstein is now walking around, he's going to get sort of a reaction that he hasn't gotten in a long time from people?
No question. And I also feel like he probably a little empathy too, right? Like he says it himself. He says, in the first cut of this, like way back when, I remember seeing this and thinking like, oh, is this like too raw? When he says the thing about, look at my life now, I'm like a director of tennis at this country club. Like this wasn't what I imagined. And you're watching that for the first time thinking, oh, is this too, did we go too far with this? Like,
it was hard. It was hard asking that question because, it's the only time you only hear our voices twice in the whole thing. There's no narrator and we don't ask questions. But we were down there in his house. We had watched him giving lessons that afternoon. And Dave and I looked at each other, and I felt like if I were watching this at home, I'd want to know what Jimmy went and became Jimmy Connors again. And as Chris Fowler and Carrillo say in the movie, Jimmy went on a run for. I don't know if people know that tennis players, especially then, the way they would monetize it is not the tournaments. When you had a run like Jimmy had, he then went on a 2-year tour of the world, Asia. Guys were paying him gigantic appearance fees to show up. So that match happens. Jimmy makes $10 million, and Aaron ends up teaching tennis at a place called St. Andrews in Boca Raton. And so I felt like, Dave and I looked at each other, we felt like we had to ask him that question. And then he's such a beautiful guy. He just answered it honestly and truly. And it's a really heartbreaking moment in the film. But then, Aaron's happily married. He's got these great kids. He knows the accomplishments he had. But I agree with you. It was when we watched it and we first cut the thing together. And we had this incredible editor, Susan E. Morse, who cut all Woody Allen's first 25 movies. Genius. And when we put this thing together and saw Aaron there, we did have a little gut check. And then we decided it's 30 for 30. Like, you're supposed to put something you wouldn't normally see on a sports show in those movies, right? That's the mission. It feels. I'm glad
you mentioned the editor because the really, really smart people who do these, they know instinctively to get the best editor possible. And the editor, it's like the difference between having Mariano Rivera as your closer versus having, Jose Mesa in 1997.
100%. If you can get, basically you want the smartest person on the whole movie to be your editor on any movie, by the way. It doesn't matter. if you can have the smartest person be the editor so that when you're bouncing ideas off of somebody, you're bouncing them off of somebody who's really able to think big picture and small. In an inside baseball way, people blow by that role. But if you look at like Academy Award winning movies and track the editors of those movies, they win them a lot. Like the best editors are almost as influential and important to the movie, and sometimes even more than the director.
We talked about David Levine, your partner for what, since the early 90s? So how far does it go back when you guys started writing?
Well, we've been best friends since we were 14 and 15 years old. I'm a year older. And so, we first met in the summer of 82. And then we wrote our first screenplay together, which was Rounders, in 96, 97.
And then it just kept going from there.
So from there, we've been filmmaking partners ever since.
And America knows him as creepy guy number 4 in The Girlfriend Experiment.
No. Hey, he's like the lead of that movie, The Girlfriend Experience. He and Sasha Grey are the leads. Yeah, here's the thing. When we act in movies, Dave gets to be the swarthy, good-looking, get-the-girl guy. When I act in a movie, I'm always in a basement.
You're in a basement.
I'm right. Like in Michael Clayton, I'm in the basement. In Premium Rush, I'm in the basement. In Thanks for Sharing, I'm in a basement. I'm always in. Someone puts me in a movie, they want me basically being a scumbag, loaning money in a basement.
The one thing you guys didn't figure out to do was to somehow get royalties on something with poker in the late 90s. There was no way to do it, but if there was a way to buy stock in the whole industry or something, and you guys knew what you had, and you knew you had Damon, and you knew you had Ed Norton. And you knew what kind of movie that was going to be. It's too bad you couldn't have just bought stock. The way Floyd Mayweather buys stock in himself before a fight.
No, we should have. Look, you can make the argument that we should have launched we should have launched a Full Tilt or something, but we were a little bit too square to do it, and I think we felt like we wanted to tell these stories, and it wasn't our place to do it. But you're right. There's no question I'd be driving, a G5 if I had done that.
We did in 2006. You, me, and Levine did before the podcast format I didn't do my first podcast, I don't think, until May 2007 was my first one. So like in 05 and 06, I used to do these long interviews where I would just trade emails with people. And I'll actually link to this when we do the link for the podcast. But the three of us did one, and we talked about a whole bunch of stuff. And as you know, I'm a junkie of Rounders. And we confronted the Gretchen Mol issue, which I think, we had to get that one out of the gate. The ultimate wet blanket girlfriend.
Yes.
What did you say you would have done differently if you could have had a mulligan on that character?
Well, no, there are a couple of mulligans we need for the movie, right? The first, most obvious one is the Famke mulligan, which is when Famke Janssen comes to the apartment.
Right.
It's like, as I've said before, it's like a science fiction film that he doesn't sleep with her. All we would have needed to do is she comes over, she doesn't mention the money, they sleep together, and in the morning she says, by the way, your friend owes money. And then he runs out. So that's one. And two, we would have just had the Gretchen character leave when she leaves at the law school. But I'm glad you brought up Curious Guy, because, and why I'm happy that I'm doing the podcast and that Levine, is here in spirit as well, because I don't think there are many people other than maybe Chuck and Malcolm who have gotten to do all this stuff with you, which is you did an NBA.
The cycle. You said you did the cycle.
The cycle now, because you did an NBA season ender using Rounders, right?
Yeah, I used Rounders quotes as awards for somewhere in like 2002, I think.
I think earlier, because, dude, it was before Knockaround Guys came out, because that's when we met. And then you came to the Knockaround Guys screening in Boston. So
it was 2000. It was my first year at ESPN.com.
Okay, so 2002. So I guess that's when that movie then came out. So 2002, right? We did that. Then we did Curious Guy with you.
Yep.
Mailbag. I've made a bunch of appearances in the Mailbag with you.
You've written on Grantland.
Written for Grantland a whole bunch. And now...
You did a 30 for 30.
30 for 30 and the podcast.
And you dated my wife. Oh, no, you didn't.
I thought we weren't going to talk about that.
Thank God you haven't dated my wife. That would have been really awkward. I want to go back to Famke Janssen, because I confronted you guys pretty much ASAP on this.
Yes.
It's almost like you need to go back and refilm that. You know how they film stuff afterwards?
You want George Lucas to come in and animate it?
I do. I think you need to animate Maybe you film two other people having sex and just kind of like figure out a way to edit it in. I don't know, something like that. Something he at least has to make out with her.
It's a giant mistake. First of all, it's a rookie. It's such a rookie error because I know we were so like kind of nerdy and we're like, well, the story has to move here, and